Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My mother cut me off at her own party with the kind of polished smile she saves for boardrooms and holiday cards. The smile that says, "Stay in your lane and do not embarrass me," and I felt the old heat rise in my chest, not the messy kind that makes you rant, but the steady kind that makes you pick a time and a place and decide that, no, you are not walking out of this room as the quiet one again. I had waited through the polite announcements and the careful speeches where people told the version of my mother that she prefers, the tireless builder, the self-made leader, the woman who never bends, and when I lifted my hand to offer a few words as her daughter, as someone who actually knows the cost of that image, she glanced at me, tilted her head like I was an ambitious intern in her way, and chirped that we should keep things moving because, bless my heart, I tend to go long and we are on a schedule, which got the kind of chuckle from the room that is worse than laughter because it is agreement in disguise. In that tiny pause when the microphone moved past me as if I were furniture, I heard the familiar internal lecture start up, the one that says be the bigger person and do not take the bait and save your energy because she always wins at her own events. And then another, different voice stepped forward, the one that does not show up often but never stutters when it does, and it said this is not a courtroom where she is the judge and you are begging for leniency. This is a party full of people who only know the brochure version and you are allowed to speak. If you grow up with someone like my mother, you learn the choreography without realizing it, how she sets the tempo and everyone nods along, how the stories she tells about you become the stories you start to repeat just to keep the peace. And it is wild how long it takes to realize that peace built on humiliation is not peace, it is slow erosion, and I had let it eat at my voice for too many years that looked a lot like obedience, but felt like being erased in public, one small cut at a time. I thought about the little digs that land like friendly jokes, how she says I am sensitive when I object to being the punchline, how she brings up my most difficult season as a cautionary tale for cousins and colleagues, how she recasts every boundary as ingratitude, and I felt something subtle that was not anger exactly, more like clarity dressed as calm, because I knew things now that I had not known when I was younger. And one of those things was that I did not need permission from the person who benefits from my silence. She has been very proud of a new venture lately, the one she mentions every chance she gets, insisting it is the smartest partnership she has ever signed, which would be fine if that were all it was, a contract and a handshake and some expansion plans. But when you listen long enough to the way someone talks about power, you start to hear the gaps, and I had followed those gaps with a kind of quiet curiosity that left me holding 3 facts and one name that could land like a dropped tray in a busy restaurant, not because I wanted chaos, but because I wanted air. After the cutoff, there was that rustling sound people make when they are ready to move on, a shuffle of bodies and small talk, and I let it roll for a moment because timing matters more than volume. Then I reached for a glass, not to throw anything or create a scene, just to use the oldest tool in the room, the gentle tap that says we are going to shift attention now, and when the first heads turned, I felt the steadiness grow the way your legs remember balance when you stop apologizing for standing upright. I said I would be brief because schedules matter, and a surprising number of faces leaned toward me the way people do when they are about to hear something off the script, and I thanked the guests for celebrating a woman who does not do half-efforts, which is true even when it is inconvenient, and I thanked the staff for keeping things running in the background because I have learned that the people who carry the trays often carry the real stories too, and then I thanked my mother, not for the insults wrapped in jokes, but for teaching me that control is not the same thing as care, which put a tiny ripple through the room that I let sit long enough to be understood. My mother tried to laugh it off with a line about my flair for drama, but the microphone was already in my hand, and I kept my tone even because I knew that the first person to get loud loses the audience. And I said that since this was a celebration of partnerships and growth, it would be strange not to acknowledge the people who make that growth possible, and I mentioned that every strong enterprise has a person whose name does not always make it into the program, yet whose choices shape the bottom line in ways that deserve attention, and the stillness that followed told me I was no longer the only one off the script. Here is the small revenge I took right there, and it was intentional and clean. I refused to be the side character at my own mother's event. I took the floor without begging. I set a frame of gratitude that carried a sharper edge than she expected. And I made it clear that I would be naming names not as a tantrum, but as acknowledgement, because nothing deflates a bully faster than realizing the target has learned to speak in complete sentences that land where they are supposed to land. I raised the glass just enough to catch the light. I said I would like to toast someone whose contribution has been talked about in quiet corners for far too long, someone whose involvement changed the stakes for my mother and for more than just her. And I watched my mother's face go still in that way it does when she senses a leak she cannot patch in public, and I said I am going to start by saying his name out loud, because silence is not the same as respect, and the room, which had been chattering only a minute earlier, went quiet enough that I could hear my own breath, and that was exactly the moment I wanted. The silence that followed my promise to say his name was not the polite, kind people use when a speech runs long. It had weight and a shape to it, because everyone in that room understood, even if they would never admit it out loud, that a family member who has been trained to smile and shrink does not announce a name unless she has already done the math on what happens next. And as that understanding settled over the tables like a held breath, my mother tried to insert herself with a hostess comment about keeping things celebratory, which would usually work because she is excellent at redirecting attention the way a magician redirects eyes. Yet tonight I felt something steadier than defiance, and I simply kept speaking in the same measured tone that says you can try to cut me off again. But I am not stepping back into the box you prefer because those walls are made of stories that never belonged to me in the first place. I said that my toast was not about tearing anyone down, which would have been satisfying in a cheap way but useless by morning, and that what I wanted instead was something my mother has always said she values in business even if she hates it at home, which is accountability that does not evaporate when the lights go up, and to get there I would have to talk about partnership in the language partners pretend not to understand when it becomes inconvenient, a language made of invoices, retainer agreements, and those tiny notes people add at the bottom of emails where they think no one is paying attention, and I watched a few men glance toward the door as if air had suddenly become scarce, which told me that the summary I was about to give would not be news to everyone present. I explained, without naming names, that there were 3 facts I had carried around like small stones in a pocket, not heavy enough to drag me down daily, but impossible to ignore once you knew they were there. And the first was that a payment labeled as an educational grant did not go to a scholarship fund as advertised, but landed in a private account that has a very convenient overlap with a vendor who always seems to win bids by a whisper. The second was that a non-disclosure agreement had been funded out of operating expenses at a moment when staff bonuses were put on hold for what was described as a temporary cash flow hiccup, and the third was that a consulting line item, sold to the board as strategic positioning, appears to have been nothing more than a backdoor way to sanitize a bad decision that a real partner would have owned in daylight, and, while I did not hold up documents or wave printouts because I am not trying to look dramatic, I did let the room know that these facts were not gossip I picked up from cousins or hairdressers, but details I encountered while doing an unglamorous favor when the assistant was out sick and my mother asked me to help review a batch of contracts she swore were routine. People sometimes talk about whistleblowing as if it is a heroic instinct that arrives fully formed, but what actually happens is that you notice something small that does not sit right, you set it aside because you want to be fair. You notice a second small thing that matches the first, you test your memory against someone who understands ledgers better than you do, and then, when the pattern stares back at you like a set of footprints across a clean floor, you realize that no amount of being the bigger person will fix what other people are willing to excuse as long as the food is good and the speeches end on time. And that realization was the moment I stopped worrying about being called dramatic and started worrying about how many quiet people had already been told to swallow their questions for the sake of a reputation. My mother, who hears subtext faster than most people hear their own names, tried another tactic by suggesting we circle back to this later, which in our family means never, and a small cluster of bored-adjacent friends nodded. But I did something I should have done years ago, and I took away the illusion that she could stall me into silence, because while I did not come here to start a fight, I also did not come here unprepared, and earlier that afternoon, when I knew there was a chance I would either be talked over or pressured into smiling. I replied all to the original invitation thread with a draft message that includes dates, amounts, and the kind of plain language even a casual reader understands. And I scheduled it to send after midnight to everyone on that chain, plus a handful of people who should have always had full visibility, and tonight I would cancel that send only after I finished my toast uninterrupted. So if anyone felt an urgent need to whistle or clap or pretend they had a phone call to make, they were welcome to try, but the clock would do the talking for me if they succeeded. I was not threatening a family, I said. I was giving a room full of grown adults the same choice I had learned to give myself, which is to hear a truth cleanly or to read it later with the cold clarity of a forwarded email that no one can misquote. And the peculiar relief that crossed a few faces told me that whatever loyalty they felt to the brand of my mother's name was weaker than the loyalty they felt to their own inboxes and reputations, which frankly made my work easier because I do not need to win a moral argument with people who only care about legal wording and reputational damage. I just need them to sit still long enough to understand that the game has changed. As a small second act of revenge, and it felt delicious because it was mature rather than messy, I thanked my mother for teaching me calendar discipline, which is how I learned timed send in the first place. And I thanked the partner I had not yet named for teaching me the value of backup copies, which made a few people flinch in the same direction at the same time, and then, before anyone could mistake my calm for hesitation, I took a breath that I did not rush and I said that I would now give the gratitude he deserves by putting his name next to his work, not as a rumor, but as a simple, complete sentence, and I watched my mother look toward him with that brittle smile she uses when she senses a crack in the glass. And I let the pause stretch exactly long enough for everyone to hear the name forming in their own minds before I said, in a voice steady enough to carry through the next room, that I would start with the person who signed the retainer I mentioned, whose signature matches the one on the exit package most of them have heard whispers about, and that his name, which I would say clearly and only once, was coming next. I said his name clearly and without rushing. I said Martin Cole, and I watched the recognition move across the room the way recognition always moves when the person being named has spent years hovering at the edges of photographs and billing statements. Close enough to profit if things go well, and far enough to dodge blame if they do not, and for a beat that felt longer than it probably was, no one made a joke or lifted a fork, because everyone knew exactly which Martin I meant, the one my mother calls a rainmaker when she wants to sound generous, and a necessary evil when she thinks no one can hear. My mother tried to tack on a light comment about how Martin hates attention and how he prefers to work behind the scenes, which might have smoothed things over on any other night, yet I stayed with the same conversational tone I would use at a kitchen table. And I said that I understood the desire to avoid the spotlight, but that when a person's name appears on a retainer alongside a consulting line that somehow keeps expanding whenever the monthly numbers look inconvenient, it becomes strange to pretend the person is invisible, and since we were celebrating partnerships, it would be nice to give him the applause people save for the visible ones, the ones who smile for the step and repeat. Because if we're going to praise growth, then we should praise all of it, even the parts that do not fit neatly on a poster. I did not raise my voice or rattle off legal codes. I simply thanked Martin for his commitment to education, which is how the payment was labeled on a transfer that never reached the scholarship account it claimed to support. And I said that because he clearly cared about students and opportunity, it would be meaningful for the room to hear about the young person who benefited. Maybe a name and a major and a short story about why this scholarship was chosen. Since impact stories are the sort of thing donors love to share when the cameras are on, and in the small span of time it took me to say those words, the man who is never at a loss for a quip found himself staring at his napkin the way people stare at a blank page when they know the truth is not going to cooperate. I could feel the room splitting into two camps, with one group praying I would pivot back to something bland and the other group hungry for the thing that had been gnawing at them for months without a name. And I took that split and used it the way you use a door that has already been opened by someone else, because there is nothing cruel about asking a grown man to talk about a donation he has been credited for in newsletters and board briefings. And there is nothing rude about suggesting we applaud him only after he gives the human details that make applause feel earned. and I asked him again, gently, if he would like to stand and tell us which student he had chosen, while adding that if he preferred, he could pass the microphone to the vendor who appears on the same paper trail, since perhaps they coordinated their generosity and would enjoy sharing the stage as partners in impact. Martin cleared his throat and said something about privacy and not wanting to make a student a spectacle, which is the kind of line that sounds noble if you have not read the ledger notes, and I nodded because I am not unreasonable. And I said I respected privacy very much, so much in fact that I had redacted all identifying details in the message scheduled to go out after midnight to the guest list when the party is over and the hangover truth is easiest to swallow. And I watched a few heads angle down the way people instinctively check their phones even when they know nothing has arrived yet, and in that small, wordless gesture I felt the balance of the night tilt away from my mother's choreography and toward something that felt like accountability with a pulse. My mother stepped in with a brisk suggestion that we move on to desserts, and I thanked her for her hospitality the way any polite guest would. Then I turned back to Martin and said that if dessert was next, this was the last. Best moment for him to clear up the misunderstanding about the scholarship transfer, because misunderstandings happen and everyone in this room has forgiven worse in business when someone stands up and tells the plain truth. And if he preferred to do it quietly later, he could send me the documentation and I would gladly include his clarification in the message, since fairness matters, and the last thing I would ever want to do is misrepresent a generous act, especially one that affects young people whose futures should not be tossed around like loose change. What made this slip under the category of revenge without me needing to raise a single decibel was not the threat of exposure, because exposure was already baked into the situation by the choices he had made and the signatures he had placed where they did not belong. The revenge was the way I put the responsibility back in his hands in front of the exact audience he and my mother performed for, and I did it with a smile that said, I am done being your family mascot and I am done pretending your work is too complicated for me to understand. And when he said he would be happy to discuss it with me privately, I said that would be lovely and that I would bring the assistant who had been out sick on the day I was asked to help. Because transparency always benefits from witnesses, and at that word, witnesses, something in the room exhaled, as if people realized this was not going to be a tantrum or a rumor mill, but a process they all recognized from their own compliance trainings. I did not let the energy collapse back into small talk. I kept it taut by raising my glass and saying that every good toast ends with gratitude, so I wanted to thank my mother's partner for giving me a chance to do something I should have done a long time ago, which is tell the truth once without a disclaimer, and as I took that sip, I watched my mother's smile lock into place like a storefront gate at closing, and I told the room that I was grateful for patience, because I had one more thank you to deliver, a thank you to the person who helped Martin make these decisions and who benefited in a way that most of us would call personal rather than professional, and I said that after dessert, if everyone still had the energy, I would share that name as well so we could congratulate them properly, since credit is best when it is shared, and the sound that rolled through the tables was not shock exactly, it was recognition trying to decide whether to show its face, which is exactly where I wanted them when the plates began to arrive. Dessert plates were landing with the kind of careful clatter that people use when they want noise to do the work of distraction, which would have amused me on another night. Yet all it did now was confirm that the room had shifted from gossip to risk calculation. And since I had promised gratitude for the person who helped Martin make these decisions, and who found a way to benefit in a manner most of us would call personal rather than professional, I stayed with the same patient tone and I said that thanking people properly means using full names, so I would do exactly that. And then I said Denise Harper, and I watched the first ring of guests around my mother exchange the kind of sideways glance you only see when a familiar name stops feeling safe. Because Denise is not a stranger who wandered in from a trade show, she is the person my mother calls her right hand in finance, the one who signs vendor approvals with a ballpoint pen she is weirdly proud of, and the one who gives those yearly speeches about ethics, where everyone nods along because the coffee is strong and no one wants to be the person who asks a follow-up that keeps them from lunch. I was not interested in turning the party into a courtroom, so I did not bark accusations or wave folders. I simply thanked Denise for the consistency she brings to procurement and budgeting. And I said that consistency is a gift, especially when times are tight, which is why I am sure she will be eager to clear up a small puzzle that appears when you compare the vendor who always wins by hair with the mailing address used for the scholarship transfer I mentioned earlier, a mailing address. That just happens to match a trust where Denise is the beneficial owner, and while trusts are not in themselves suspicious and families set them up for perfectly ordinary reasons, it becomes a different conversation when money labeled for education temporarily visits a mailbox that belongs to the person who also signs off on vendor selections and then takes the scenic route before landing wherever it is supposed to land. A route that would make any auditor ask for a simple explanation and a short paper trail, nothing theatrical, just dates and signatures that line up without the usual wincing. My mother tried to let us not confuse people line, the one where she acts as a tour guide through her own decisions, as if the rest of us are tourists who speak a different language. And I let her finish, because I am done feeding the story that I am the one who interrupts. Then I said that confusion is a choice adults make when clarity is inconvenient, and that to make clarity easier for everyone I had prepared a plain summary with 3 columns and 0 adjectives, which would be arriving in inboxes after midnight unless I canceled it, and that the summary included not only the retainer and the consulting line that kept expanding whenever the month went sideways, but also the overlapping addresses that turn a scholarship label into a question rather than a brag, and, because fairness matters, the summary includes a short note at the top inviting Denise or Martin to reply all with any corrections or context they believe the group deserves, and I promise to forward those replies to the same recipients in the morning, so no one would accuse me of leaving out their side. Denise smiled the way people smile when they are trying to look both calm and insulted, and she said something about how trusts are complicated, and I agreed quickly because they are. Then I said that complication is not a synonym for secrecy and that lots of complicated things are explained to regular people every day by professionals who know how to use short words and straight lines, and if she preferred, she could send me a 2-sentence note tonight naming the student and the school and the date the funds were received by that school, and I would paste it at the top of the message before it went out, because if a young person actually got help then they deserve the credit and the grace, and if a routing detour happened for a boring reason, then boring reasons hold up well in daylight. What I did next was small and, to me, perfectly satisfying, because it flipped the particular humiliation my mother favors without drawing blood, and it was this. I asked the caterer if we could hold coffee for 5 minutes so we might finish the thank yous cleanly. Then I thanked my mother for trusting me long enough to ask me to help when her assistant was sick, which is how these documents passed through my hands in the first place, and I thanked the assistant by name as well, because witnesses keep people honest, and I said I would bring her with me when we meet with Denise and Martin next week to make sure our memories line up with the numbers, and in the space between my words and the first clink of a fork, I felt the room accept that I was not backing down and also not frothing at the mouth, which left them with fewer easy ways to dismiss me. A couple of board-adjacent friends tried to float a compromise about taking this offline, and I said that offline used to mean a hallway conversation that stayed in the hallway. But tonight offline means an email with timestamps and recipients who will not pretend later that they did not know, and since no one in this room is allergic to compliance when it protects them, we are not going to act allergic to it now just because it makes dessert a little awkward, and I ended by saying that I would give Denise the same courtesy I gave Martin, which is to say her name once clearly and then invite her to add whatever facts she believes were missing, and if she preferred to do that after we cut cake, that would be fine. Because the time send does not care whether people are chewing when the truth arrives. For the 4th revenge, and it landed so cleanly, I wanted to clap for myself. I took away the last refuge of ambiguity by looking at my mother and saying that this was her moment to demonstrate the leadership she is constantly praised for. The kind that absorbs heat without redirecting blame to the person pointing at the stove, and I said I would be quiet for exactly 1 minute if she wanted the microphone to reassure her guests that she welcomes questions and that her partner and her finance lead would provide documentation to the group before close of business tomorrow. And as the room counted that minute in their heads the way people always do when a timer is running, my mother inhaled and started to form a sentence that sounded like control dressed as concern, and I watched her glance toward Martin and then toward Denise, and I watched both of them fail to meet her eyes at the same time. And I knew that when she finally spoke, the sentence would either cancel the send or pour gasoline on it, which is why I let the silence grow teeth and then said that if she needed help finding the right opening, I had one in mind, 3 words long and easy to repeat, and I left it there. Because handing your mother the script she refused you for years is a kind of justice that does not need volume to be heard. When I told my mother that I had 3 words for her and that they would fit in any leadership book she has ever quoted at me, I watched her flick through every old trick she keeps on the shelf, the gracious laugh that buys time, the charming sigh that invites rescue, the little look toward the partner whose name I had already said out loud, and the finance lead whose title used to make people stop asking questions, and when neither of them stepped forward with a lifeline because neither of them could risk borrowing my microphone, I offered the words without ceremony, and I offered them with the same calm I had been practicing all night, and I said, say we will audit. Say it into the room that believes you when you sound decisive. Say it with your full name attached and with tomorrow on the calendar, because if you do that now, I will cancel the message scheduled for after midnight, and I will replace it with a summary of the commitments you made and the steps you announced, and if you do not, the message will go to the same people you call partners and friends, and it will include everything you just heard, along with the timeline that shows when this stopped being a misunderstanding and became a choice. It was not a threat so much as a correction to the way things normally go, because the usual pattern is I get told to lower my voice and protect the brand. And tonight, I wanted the brand to protect the people who have been told to smile while their bonuses were paused and their questions were parked, and I did not need her to confess or to collapse or to give me a hug that would photograph well. I needed her to accept the premise that leadership is not a mood and that promises without dates are napkins with slogans. So I said the next sentence very clearly, and I said it in the kind of language that does not let anyone hide, and I told her that if she made the commitment now, it would include an independent firm announced by morning, a suspension of Martin and Denise pending review, a written update to staff by end of day with the bonuses restored, and a public confirmation that any funds labeled for education would be rerouted immediately and documented with names and dates and receipts, and that I would cancel the midnight message only when those 4 items were on paper and only after she repeated them into the microphone, so there would be no confusion about what the room had heard. For a few long beats, she did the thing that used to make me feel like a child, the patient tilt of the head that implies she is deciding whether to indulge me or correct me, and then she saw what I had already seen, which is that the faces around her were no longer waiting for a rescue line. They were waiting for leadership that did not come wrapped in euphemisms. And she understood that the cost of pretending nothing had happened would be higher than the cost of stepping into the truth, so she reached for the microphone and, without looking at me, said that the company would begin an independent audit immediately, that the board would be notified before sunrise, that both Martin and Denise would step back while everything was reviewed, that staff would receive a written update about bonuses and timelines, and that any funds labeled for scholarships would be accounted for in plain language by the time office lights came on, and she said it in the voice she uses in quarterly calls, which is to say the voice the room had been trained to trust, and for the first time that evening I felt the ground move beneath us in a way that did not owe me an apology. There was a beat of applause that no one knew quite how to shape, because people clap for promises and for finales and for rescue boats, and this was none of those and also all of them. And when it faded, I said thank you, and I told the room that I would cancel the time send now that the commitments had been made publicly, and I added that I would send a different message before dawn containing the bullet points she had just said aloud, and that I would include the firm's contact information when she named it, and that I would copy the staff list so no one had to rely on secondhand versions from people who treat clarity like a competitive sport, and then I did the last small thing I had planned, the quiet detail that closes a loop without slamming a door, and I held up my phone and said that, because I have a memory that gets accused of dramatizing, I had been recording my own toast for my therapist, and that the audio had already been backed up to a shared folder labeled with tonight's date, which is not a scandal and not a threat, just an assurance that what was promised would match what was delivered, and that if anyone wanted to double-check phrasing in the morning, I would happily provide a transcript with timestamps. My mother nodded the way people nod when a negotiation ends without confetti, and she reached for a joke that might have worked on a different night about families keeping each other honest, and I let it pass through the room without catching it. Because I was done patting the fall and done rescuing an image that has been fueled for years by other people's silence, and I finished my toast with gratitude that did not taste sweet. I thanked the guests for their patience. I thanked the staff again by name because they always get left out of stories like this, and I thank the room for accepting that transparency is not an attack and that daughters do not owe their mothers a lifetime of swallowing things that burn on the way down. And then I put the microphone back exactly where I found it and I sat down without asking whether I had been too much, because tonight the answer to that question was finally irrelevant. The aftermath did not play out like a movie with shouting and smashed plates. It unfolded the way real things unfold when people fear exposure more than they love denial, with a cluster of quiet conversations, with a partner making calls near a doorway, with a finance lead standing very still while a board member asked whether a morning would do for a meeting, and with my mother looking at me the way a person looks at a mirror they have avoided for too long, and I took my small victory without turning it into a victory lap. I drank water because my hands were shaking in a way no one needed to see. I texted the assistant and told her to sleep in because tomorrow would be long but survivable. And I opened the email draft I had prepared for the alternative version of this night, and I replaced it with a clean list of commitments and a line that said thank you for your attention. The transcript will be available upon request. And I hit send and watched the message leave my outbox like a note I had been writing for years without realizing it. People later asked me whether I felt bad for making a scene, which is a funny phrase for a night that finally refused to be staged, and I told them that I felt relief more than anything because I did not ask for my mother to be reduced. I asked for the truth to be enlarged until it could stand up without me holding it, and if that meant some reputations had to stop wearing heels they could not walk in, then so be it. And as I left the party to air that felt ordinary and good, my phone buzzed with the first of the confirmations I had demanded, a simple line from my mother that said the firm had been retained and the staff update would go out at 9, and I let myself smile because the plan I had carried, the plan that lived in pauses and backups and quiet sentences spoken out loud at the right time, had done exactly what it was built to do, which was make silence more expensive than change, and while nothing about this family would ever be simple, tonight ended with a win that did not need a judge, and that finally felt like justice.